process used to basically find information about the network, their users, and the victims. So if you're an attacker and you want to gather information about the victim, you can launch what we call a passive reconnaissance attack or an active reconnaissance attack. In a passive reconnaissance attack, the threat actor investigates the victim without actually launching an active scan to their network. And they do this by searching key users, executives, or any other victims within the organization that they want to attack in social media, things like using tools like Spookio to search online public records, and also using more automated tools like Maltigo. And now that I mentioned Maltigo is a great tool that analyzes real-world relationships between information that is actually publicly accessible in the internet. So this includes footprinting the internet infrastructure, as well as gathering information about the people and the organization who owns it, right? So Maltigo can be used to determine these relationships, between many different entries or entities, including people, so gathering information about specific person, like the names, the email addresses, any type of aliases they have used, personal identifiable information if they can, things like physical addresses, the date of birth, what are the users, likes and hobbies, who did they work before, and what are their specialties, so that, let's say they actually find information about a user that is a sales manager in an organization, and was able to correlate information from things like LinkedIn and see that the person actually had a job at a different company about 2 years ago. They can actually personalize their attack later on, by actually gathering this information. So again, tools like Maltigo actually makes this really easy to determine these type of relationships and also correlate those with other users or groups of people, right? So using social networks, looking at, what are your Facebook friends, what other connections you have on LinkedIn, who do you interact in Twitter, the companies, again, that you actually have worked for, any organizations that you belong to, any websites that actually have information about you, any personal websites as well, internet infrastructure information like domains, DNS names, net blocks, and IP addresses of that organization, and then associate that, with the specific users, any type of affiliations that are there, and of course, anything that you can find on the internet as far as documents and files related to the victim. So connection between these pieces of information are actually found using open source intelligence techniques by querying sources such as DNS records, WHOIS records, search engines, social networks, and various, online APIs, and extracting, metadata about the victims. Another great tool that is actually used for passive attacks is the Social Engineering Toolkit. People call it SET, right? SET. This is a tool that was created by Dave Kennedy. He's actually a personal friend of mine, and is used by many pen testers and real-world attackers to perform social engineering attacks. So social engineering toolkit is a menu-driven attack-based system, which is fairly unique because it supports multiple scenarios, options, and different customizations that you can actually do. So, for example, you can launch a spear phishing attack, even, right, or send target email attacks against a victim. You can send multiple emails based on what you learn about that victim or individual through your searches, or by using Maltigo, like I mentioned before, or you can even send malicious attachments to the victim to actually try to compromise their system as well, right? So since the social engineering toolkit is integrated with the Metasploit, it actually makes it easy to carry this type of attacks. Now that I mentioned Metasploit is an exploitation framework. You will learn a little bit more about it later in several other lessons. But again, it's actually a tool or a framework that includes many tools that are used by many pen testers and, of course, also attackers nowadays. Now that I mentioned social engineering, let's go over what exactly is social engineering, right? So, and what are these type of attacks, right? So these attacks leverage what we call the weakest link, which is a human, right? So there's a saying out there that there's actually no patch to human stupidity. It's actually kind of true. If the attacker can get the user to reveal information, it's way easier for the attacker to actually cause some harm rather than using some other method of reconnaissance or some tools, right? Some sophisticated tools. So this could be done through just an email or a misredirection of a web page. So the result is in the user actually clicking something that leads to the attacker getting information about that user, or to a malicious link or so. Social engineering can also be done in person by an insider or an outside entity, or over the phone. Primary example of that is if you get a phone call of somebody impersonating a bank, asking you or telling you that your bank account has been compromised, or there has been some fraudulent charges, and then of course they want you to verify your account information and provide personal information over the phone. And another primary example is the attacker leveraging normal user behavior. So let's think for a second that you're a security professional who you're in charge of network firewalls or other infrastructure equipment in your company. An attacker actually can post a job offer for a fairly lucrative and attractive position, right? So, and it makes it very attractive, to the victim, in this case, you, the security professional. And, they can put in the job description, list of, pretty good benefits and compensation far beyond what you're probably already making at your company. Then whenever you apply for that position, the criminal or the attacker even schedules an interview with you, right? And then some of these criminal organizations actually have local folks, that doesn't look like actually they're calling from a different country. If not, they actually will, persuade you to actually, tell you, to tell information about yourself and about the company, right? So since you're likely to, quote unquote, show off your skills and your work, right, to get a job, he may ask you, how do you configure those firewalls? What other network infrastructure devices your company actually has? What other security products they actually have, deployed, and how they have deployed it. So you may even disclose information about the firewalls using your network, how you configure them, how you design them. And this definitely gives the attacker a lot of knowledge and information about the organization, even without performing any type of scanning or active reconnaissance in the network, right? So other social engineering techniques include phishing, whenever the attacker actually presents a link that looks like a valid, trusted resource to a user, right, through an email. And then whenever that user clicks on the link, is prompted to disclose confidential information such as usernames or passwords. Another one is farming, and that's whenever the attacker uses this technique to direct the customer's URL from a valid resource to a malicious one that could be made to appear as a valid site for the user, right? So from there, an attempt is actually made to extract confidential information from the user and from the organization, right? So another example is malvertising. Malvertising is the act of incorporating malicious ads on trusted websites. So, that's the key, in trusted websites, which, definitely will fool the user and results in the user's browsing or the browser being, redirected to sites hosting malware, right? So that's what it is very important. So it is extremely important that a security-aware culture must include ongoing training that consistently informs all employees about the latest security threats, as well as policies and procedures that you can reflect the overall vision and mission of the corporate information security in your organization. This emphasis, on security helps employees, understand the potential risk of social engineering threats, how they can prevent, against such attacks, and why their role, within the security culture is critical for, the overall corporate health, right? So, security-aware employees are definitely better prepared to recognize and avoid rapidly changing and increasingly sophisticated, social engineering attacks, are more willing to take ownership of security responsibilities, right? So one of the things that actually we do at Cisco is that from time to time we actually send what it looks like a regular email, perhaps through a survey or to benefits for the different employees, and we send these emails throughout the corporation, not only to see how many users, of course, are actually clicking on those links that we send or probably attachments, but also to train the users that that not emails are equal, of course, and that you should not be clicking on things that you should not trust, right? Or it may be good to be good, too good to be truth in some cases, right? So now official security policies and procedures take guessworks out of operations, so helps employees make the right security decisions, and this type of policies actually includes things like password management, of course more authentication capabilities for VPN users and local users, like two-factor authentication. That also includes, of course, the anti-phishing defenses and antiviruses. Change management. A documented change management process is actually more secure than an ad hoc process, right? Which is more easily to be exploited by an attacker who claims to be in a crisis. Information classification, policies, document handling and destruction policies, and of course, physical security policies as well. That are, include the scanning of the network to find out which IP addresses respond, and then to further scan those devices to see which ports of the devices, those IP addresses are actually open. Active scans are carried by tools called scanners, so pretty self-explanatory. I'm showing here a few commercial and open source application and vulnerability scanners. One of the most popular ones is actually Nmap. I'm going to show you, Nmap in a few minutes. There's also another one called Nessus, by Tenable Network Security. They actually have a commercial, entity or license for it, but you can download it for free as well. There's a very popular one called Nexpose by Rapid7. That's actually very popular among penetration testers. QualisGuard is another, scanner that also includes web application scanning. It's developed by Qualys. There are many others, especially for, application and web application vulnerability scanning, such as, AppScan from IBM, Burp Suite. Burp actually has a free and a commercial version. That's a great tool to actually look for vulnerabilities in a web application. Pyros Proxy, the list goes on and on, as you can actually see here. So this is for your reference. So be aware that these attacks are not launched only from individuals outside of the company, but they're also launched from people and devices inside of your company sometimes, right? So it's what we call the insider, threat. So in a lot of places, actually, you see scanning actually being done not only by humans but compromised machines that are already in the network, that are trying to actually find all the devices that they can actually compromise and steal information from. So this vector is of particular concern these days, with the proliferation of organizations allowing employees to even bring their own devices, right? So what we call BYOD, that allows them to access data, applications, and devices in the corporate network. So some, those devices, some of the devices may actually be compromised, right? So as soon as actually they come into the network, they actually start scanning and looking for vulnerabilities that they can actually exploit. Perhaps the user is also curious, right? So these applications are actually commonly used for even troubleshooting, right? So, you can scan to see what IP addresses actually are available in the network and what type of ports are actually open and things like that. So it may be used by a non-malicious user, of course, as well. Or maybe, of course, a backdoor is installed on the computer, which the user is actually logged into. And then in that case, an outside attacker can be actually launching an attack, in stealth mode. So in either case, it is important to implement a security policy that takes nothing for granted, right? So that's very important. Don't take anything for granted and be prepared to mitigate risk at several levels, including inside a threat, right? So now there are different types of port and network scanning techniques. The following, are some of the most common ones. The first one is basic port scan. It actually involves the scanning of a predetermined TCP or UDP port by sending a specifically, configured packet that contains the port number of the port that was actually selected. So this is typically used to determine what ports are actually open or available in a given system. There's also a TCP scan, which of course is a TCP-based scan to a series of ports on a machine to determine, the port availability. There's within TCP, there's also, many different variances of it, right? So you can do a TCP scan, which is one of the most common types of TCP scanning, that is also referred to as a half-open scanning. And that's because it never actually opens a full TCP connection, right? So it doesn't do a full TCP three-way handshake. So the scanner sends a SYN packet. If the target, responds then with a SYN Ack, then the scanner typically says, this port is actually open, and it may actually even reply back with a reset packet, right? So another TCP scan type is a Tcp Ack. So this type of scan does not actually or exactly determine the TCP ports that are open or closed. However, it checks if the port is filtered or unfiltered by that application or system, right? So TCP Ack scans are typically used when trying to see if a firewall is deployed and its rule sets are taking effect, right? So there are also TCP FIN packets that in some cases they can bypass legacy firewalls, since closed ports may cause a system to reply to a FIN packet with a corresponding reset packet because of the nature of TCP. Now there's a type of scanning that is called a UDP scan. Now, UDP is a connectionless protocol, so it doesn't have a three-way handshake like TCP. So the UDP scans have to rely on ICMP port unreachable messages to determine if the port is actually open. So when the scanner sends a UDP packet, the port is actually not open on the victim side or the victim system. That system will respond back with an ICMP port unreachable message. And this type of scanning, will definitely be affected by firewalls and, devices that actually rate limit or block ICMP, right? So that's the reason that a lot of people actually say that UDP scanning is not that effective. Now, there's another type of scan called the Strobe Scan. And typically it's used by an attacker to find the ports that he or she already knows, how to actually exploit. So he already knows that there's an open port, but they actually want to, Strobe Scan to execute on a more confined level of scanning. Now there's a stealth scan, and basically a stealth scan is any, scan that is designed to go undetected by network auditing tools, right? So again, there's many different types of scanning mechanisms that we actually have in here. The first example that I'm showing here is the Nmap Scanner. And basically here I'm actually just doing what we call a ping sweep to a network with the IP addresses of 192.168.78.0 with a 24-bit mask. And as you can see here, actually it scans the network and finds what devices are actually up And it actually even provides a little bit more information, right? So it provides the MAC address. It provides even, if we can determine what type of devices, some of them, maybe Cisco devices, other ones, like I'm seeing here. This is actually my house. I have a couple of Google Chromecast. I have a smart home device, several Cisco, devices in my house. Even Raspberry Pi that actually you're seeing here, that you can determine that, of course, there's a Raspberry Pi in that specific network. So again, this is actually what we call a ping scan or ping sweep. And basically it's just a ICMP package to see what devices are there and gathers information from that. Then after that, you can launch a more specific scan, right? So in this case, I'm actually just doing a light scan for TCP for a host of 192.168.78.8. That's a Linux host that I have in this network. And if you can see here, that device actually has SSH open, so port 22, port 25 for mail, SMTP actually open. It has a bind DNS server as well. It's running actually the HTTP server on port 80. It's running again a mail server which supports POP3 and Nmap, and you can even see the OS type and the kernel version. So it was actually able to do what we call OS fingerprinting, so the operating system fingerprinting. It actually has a whole bunch of other information about the device itself. So again, this is a type of fairly basic scanning, but that provides you with a lot of information, right? So there's also a GUI or a graphical user interface for Nmap called Zen Map, and that's what I'm actually showing here. So basically, I launched the same attack that you saw in the CLI, but in this case, I'm doing it through the GUI. In there, you can actually see the Nmap output with the ports that we went over already. You can see, if you click on the port and host tab, you can see those in a little bit more graphical interface. You can see a topology. In this case, I'm actually just going directly connected to that device. So I'm in the same network. But if I was not in the same network, perhaps, you will be able to actually see a better graphical representation of the network. You can also see the host details, TCP sequence information, other information that you can gather from the system itself. Even when was last booted or rebooted. So again, you can actually this type of scanning through the GUI or through the CLI. And here I'm actually just showing you a reference of an Nmap cheat sheet or tutorial that actually goes over a lot of different command examples or scanning examples using the Nmap Scanner. Again, this is actually a free scanner. I would probably suggest for you, as you prepare for the exam, to actually use it, download it, and use it. Just use it in your network against your own machine, but just become familiar of the actual output, right? So this is one of the first steps that in a lot of cases, actually pen testers and attackers actually use to gather information about a network and a system. And then once it enumerates, this type of ports, then it can carry over potentially, a more sophisticated attacks, right? So it can look for vulnerabilities in the system, exploit those vulnerabilities. Once the vulnerabilities are actually compromised or exploited and the system is actually compromised, they can launch other attacks throughout their organization, right? So they can do lateral movement and, potentially exfiltrate information from your organization.